Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast. I'm David French with Curtis Chang. And before we dive into the substance today, which is going to be pretty heavy January 6th, I got to congratulate Curtis. Curtis, well, here's the good news. Well, let me start with the bad news. The bad news is my Grizzlies did not win the championship. The good news is that your Warriors did, and I'm pretty convinced after the playoffs that my Grizzlies were the second best team in the NBA.
Yeah, well, I guess I'll give you that. You could take consolation in that, but my goodness, what a series it was! I sweated it out. Even when we were up by like 10 going into like the last few minutes, I was super on edge. And but virtue prevails, David, and so we could take solace in that world. We're not sure virtue is going to prevail in our political realm, but in our sports realm, we can be certain that good has won out.
Well, right after it was over, T. Morant, who is Ja Morant's dad, tweeted out that the Grizzlies gave the champs the toughest fight. And
they did.
They did. Yeah. I immediately retweeted that as truth. We were literally 2 shots away from beating y'all. One was Ja Morant's missed driving layup. And to call it a layup is to really underplay the difficulty of the shot, but he had a missed driving shot in game 1 that would have won the game. And then Dylan Brooks missed a step back 3 in game 6 or game 4. I can't remember. I'm blocking it out. Too traumatic.
I think a healthy Ja Morant could have easily tipped that series, and you guys are coming for us, but we're the old G. We're defending the hill. Come and get us.
4 titles. I mean, it's now time to talk about where Steph fits in the pantheon, and that's what we're going to address for the next 50 minutes.
Awesome. That's great. Let's talk about that. But no, I don't think we're going to actually talk about that. I think our viewer ratings may suffer a bit if we go down too far that road. So David, what are we going to talk about today?
Yeah, so what we're going to talk about is the January 6th Commission. And we're going to talk about it from sort of a cultural and political standpoint, yes, but we're also going to talk about it because there was an aspect of this that really stood out to me, Curtis, and as really presenting very starkly in that moment. Okay, I'm going to clarify. I'm going to say in that moment, the starkly different ways in which starkly different ways in which Christians interact with the public square and how Christianity manifests itself in the public square. And I'm referring to outside of the Capitol building, and then of course storming inside of it, was a form of Christian nationalism / dominionism and extremism that was seeking to impose a Christian seeking to impose a Christian politics upon our culture through sheer force. And then inside was Mike Pence literally reading scripture to inspire him and to give him the fortitude, and praying to get the fortitude to resist that Christian mob. And I say Christian mob, I don't mean to say they were exclusively Christian, but they were disproportionately Christian, I'll tell you that. And so we want to explore some of those themes, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But first, let me ask you, Curtis, have you been watching? How have you been reacting?
I have not been watching the hearings the way I have been watching the NBA Finals. Let me put it to you that way. I've not been as engaged. And I would say I am not alone in that regard, in the sense of asking myself, do I want to invest the energy and time to watch these hearings, or even read deeply about them for people who just schedule-wise can't maybe watch all of them live. In my conversations with my friends, I have found a general sense of disengagement from the hearings. Mm-hmm. And even when you look at the ratings, we're talking about an event that is describing how perilously close our democracy came to deep peril, to deep threat in our generation, and probably any generation almost since the Civil War. You can make an argument for that. And when you look at the ratings, it's about the same as Sunday Night Football in terms of the total viewership, which granted is a
I mean,
It's a big.
is that half empty or is that half full?
That's true. That's true. But it does speak a little bit to, kind of where our eyes are drawn to, right? And I think when I reflect on my own temptation to disengage, and when I talk to my friends about why they're not paying close attention, the theme comes up repeatedly, which is, well, it isn't going to change anything. It isn't going to change anything. Nothing is going to change in terms of a political outcome, in terms of setting our country on a better course. That's, I think, is a widespread perception, and one I find warring within myself as far as how much I should invest in the hearing. So I want to turn it back to you, and let's just, because I actually want to explore the issue you raised in terms of what it symbolized and displayed in terms of some important truths about how Christians interact with power. So I want to get back to that. But before we do that, I want to ask you this question. Is anything going to change from a political outcome and future of our country perspective? Does the hearings have any chance of changing anything?
Yes. So the short answer to that question is a chance. Yes, absolutely, it has a chance. And I think it has more of a chance than people think. I'm going to make the optimistic case. Certainly, it's not a certainty. And if you think your evidence of change, of whether or not it's created a change, is the midterm elections, you're thinking completely in the wrong frame. You're thinking you're making this overly partisan if you're thinking of the midterm elections, because look, already things were going to be, just by historical trends, we're going to be rough for the Democrats. I mean, there's tends to be a midterm swing. That's just been a pattern of American politics for a long time. It's so common that we mainly remember the exceptions to the rule, like in 2002, when right after 9/11, when Bush was still very, very, very popular, there was, the Republicans had modest gains. But so the basic view is, look, combination of midterms and terrible economic news, January 6 hearings aren't going to overcome. I mean, they're not going to overcome that. So don't look at it in that lens. Look at it in the lens of a few things. One, cultural influence on how we're going to view not just Donald Trump, but how we're going to view sort of this whole concept of the health of the American democracy, the strength or fragility of the American republic, cultural change. And then the other one that's really important is legal. If you are laying the foundation right here and you're sort of exposing to the public the grounds for a potential prosecution of Donald Trump, what you're doing is you're essentially softening the ground for something that could otherwise be almost violently contentious, and still could be violently contentious. Now, the January 6th committee is not going to define whether Donald Trump committed a crime. It's not the tribunal for that. It's not an adversarial proceeding, for example. And, I've said from the beginning that the real Donald Trump legal jeopardy is much more in Georgia, rather than Washington, D.C., related to the events of January 6th itself. But I do think there's a cultural impact here. There's a legal impact here, a cultural/legal impact here. And quite possibly this could be one of these additional things that sort of pushes Donald Trump further out of contention in the GOP primary in 2024. So I think all of those things are in play. But Twitter is totally dominated by this idea of, the January 6th hearings are a waste when only 20 million people watch, which is more than watch any game of the NBA Finals, by the way.
That's true.
Only 20 million people watch, and because it's not going to impact the midterms. But that's the wrong lens. The short-term politics of it is not the correct lens to view something this momentous.
Well, I actually want to shift even further to the lens, to even the personal and the spiritual, because I think I want to put on my pastor's hat and try to frame this experience, this historic opportunity for our listeners, and why and how ought we to watch these hearings, even from a personal, spiritual perspective. And by do that, I actually want to make an analogy to the NBA Finals, because David, I watched the NBA Finals in a very peculiar, and I'm a little embarrassed to admit how I watched the finals. So as we go deeper into the finals, when my Warriors are in contention, which they have been in for many of the last 10 years, I'm actually overly engaged. I'm overly invested in that story and in the team, such that I get a bit anxious. Well, actually, I get a lot anxious while I'm watching the game. I'm as you know, I'm writing a book on anxiety. I'm a person that sort of struggles with anxiety, and man, when the finals are on the line, I get really anxious watching them, and I especially get really anxious during commercial breaks. And man, there are long commercial breaks in an NBA game, especially the last like 3 minutes of a game, right? And I'm like bouncing off the wall. I'm pacing. I'm a mess. And so my adaptation to that is I wait until the game is over. Try not to check the score, but I wait till the game is over so I can watch it on, YouTube TV or, some service, so that I can fast forward through the commercials. Because otherwise, during those commercials, when I'm waiting for the game to come back on, I just get way too anxious. So I tell that story to say, when I am watching the game personally, in no way am I influencing the outcome. And of course, even when any of us are watching the game live, even we're not influencing the outcome, but we at least have a feeling of influencing the outcome because it's live, and it's like we're cheering on a live event unfolding in all of its uncertainty at the moment. So we at least have that feeling like we're influencing something by cheering, shouting, screaming. I don't even have that illusion, right? Because the game's over. The outcome has been predetermined. I am not changing anything by watching the game. But I am being changed. I am being changed by when I watch the game. And this is the nature of when we watch any public narrative, any public story unfolding. And sports is just a very highly dramatized structured narrative that's being played out before us, right? And one of the ways that, in fact, the fundamental way that human beings are formed in virtue, right? And this is true for Christians or non-Christians, but I think this is especially true for Christians, that we are formed in virtue through story, through watching, reading, participating in stories. Virtue only occurs in the context of a story. So if you want to get geeky about this, read the philosopher Alistair McIntyre. He really made this point brilliantly. Just that you only can understand or grasp virtue in the context of story. Because just for instance, if you want your child to develop perseverance, right? Perseverance is an abstraction. They learn perseverance by reading The Little Train That Could. And that's how they get a picture of perseverance. Or by watching Klay Thompson recover from 941 days of rehab.
I'm happy for him, by the way. I'm happy.
We are, and we do. And so, right, that's part of the emotional attachment I have, and I think many people have, to watching a story like Klay Thompson. Like, here's this guy who suffered devastating injuries, just longed to get back out on the court for himself, but also especially to be back with his brothers in arms. And just, 900, that's like almost 3 years of struggle, of perseverance, and to see him out there performing at the highest level, there's a sense of like, yes, we're cheering that on and we're participating in something virtuous there. And that's I think deep down why we're drawn to sports and sports narratives. Now, of course, there's some oversimplification going on, right? These sports heroes are complex characters. They're follow the mix. You can't, it would be a mistake to reduce them solely to like perfect paragons of a virtue. But it doesn't take away from the fact that they do embody some virtue. So I want to invite us to actually apply that same lens to January 6th, because as you even started in your introduction, I think it's something of a narrative. It's something of a morality play that's playing out before us that, regardless of whether or not it changes a political outcome, either long-term or short-term, it has the power to change us. It has the power for us to actually recognize and perhaps even, kind of cultivate certain important virtues for ourselves and especially for how we engage in institutions, engage in politics. So David, what do you think about that lens?
Yeah. Oh, no, I think that's incredibly important. And just to, echo your statement about the power of story, I know for me, stories have been incredibly powerful throughout my life in defining who I am. I'll just give you one, I guess, somewhat corny example. Most listeners would know that I love the Lord of the Rings, both the books and the Peter Jackson adaptation, not of The Hobbit.
Well, we're on video, so I don't know. Can you show them the sword? Can we show our viewers the sword?
Some of the hardcore Dispatch members have seen the sword, so we'll just leave that. Okay. But I have a replica of Aragorn's sword in Return of the King, and Dural, reforged, of course, of Narsil. But anyway, there's this really interesting moment. There's this contrast. Those who have read the books know of this contrast between two brothers, Boromir and Faramir. Boromir, who ultimately grasps for the ring and grasps for the ring of power. And it's one thing that, leads to his demise. And Faramir, who has the ring of power essentially in his grasp and offered to him, declines. And there's this really incredible moment in the movies that sort of makes Faramir's internal dialogue audible, and he says to himself, "Time for Faramir, captain of Gondor, to demonstrate his quality." And it wasn't in the big moment of a cavalry charge against the orcs, but it was in this really small moment, this pivotal small moment, where he had the ability to just freely take what was, available to him. And I've thought about that often in sort of these moments in my life that are quiet and, hidden and nobody knows about. And I just think about that phrase, time to demonstrate your quality. And that's a story. That's a part of a story. And it makes a difference in people's lives. And, it's interesting. There's so many layers here to this January 6th story, Curtis. And some of it's about us and some of it's about the folks who were in January 6th. And here's one that's kind of about us. How do we view people? And this is a question that I think is particularly relevant for Twitter world. How do we view people who made what we believe to be a lot of bad and enabling decisions for a long time, who, when the chips were down and their lives were in danger, made a right decision? And here's why I ask this, because I've seen something that troubles me. And what I've seen that troubles me is when you've seen people who've made a right decision when their lives were under threat, when there was an enormous pressure to make the wrong decision, who risked themselves to make the right decision, the lens through which people view them is still dominated by all of the wrong decisions they made before. Well, sure, Mike Pence might have, saved the American Republic on January 6th, but he was an enabler for 4 years before then. So I'm not going to have, any particular regard for this man still, even though I might be, kind of grateful for what he did. And let me ask you this, Curtis, because I will confess to you, I had a lot of very profoundly negative feelings for Mike Pence for a long time. And I don't now. I don't. I'm not going to say they're gone. I'm not going to say I don't disagree with the way he acted for 4 years, but there's something in my attitude towards him that just fundamentally changed, especially as I learned more about the personal risks he took, about the way in which he refused to get in a Secret Service car to leave because he would not be seen leaving the Capitol. When I learned about the campaign to get him to relent, and then when I learned about what he could have done according to the theory of the Eastman memos, I have to admit, my heart has softened towards him considerably. So I would just wonder, where are you on this, and where do you think we should be on this?
That's a great question. I'm like you. I have suffered the last 4 years, or the 4 years of Pence's vice presidency in deep frustration. Here is this man who claims to be deeply motivated by Christ, by biblical values, and yet on so many turns just seems like he's caving in to pressure, caving into the desire to remain in power, to remain close to power. I was so deeply frustrated. And I'm with you. My heart is also softened from hearing the story about what happened. And I think this gets to why story and paying attention to story, public narratives even, like the January 6th story, is so critical, because the nature of story is that it shows change. It shows actual people and character change in all directions, for good and for ill, right? And so even to go back to your story of Faramir and Boromir, there's a lot of Faramir and Boromir comparisons we can make, we can apply to January 6th. But for those of you who aren't familiar with the story of Boromir, he is the one who tries to grab for power, and he wants to be close to power, and he's bought into the narrative that by grabbing power, he can actually save his beloved city, right? That's why he wants the ring from Frodo, is so they can take it back to his home city and wield it in virtuous fashion. But of course, that's the fallacy. The fallacy is that you can sort of grab power to save a higher good, grab power in an unvirtuous way, right? And I would say that was the narrative. That Boromir narrative was, from a distance, is what I saw as animating Pence's rationale for why he's staying close to Trump and going along with things. Like, I'm going to be close to power so I can act virtuously, even though I have to make all these incredible compromises to my own integrity, to the integrity of the American Republic and so forth. But I'm acting for our good. But in the end, the Boromir story, remember, David, how the Boromir story ends?
Yes. Yeah.
Right? He ultimately resists that, and he ultimately acts virtuously, giving his life in defending Frodo so that Frodo can be the true bearer of the ring, and he dies at the onslaught of the orcs. And, well, we're not going to say exactly who I think the orcs are in the January 6th story, but it's the mob, right? Like, it's the with
wait,
Lord
you're going to
Sauron
not
behind
say
the
who
mob.
they are and then say who they are. Okay,
Then I say who they are. But he ultimately, Boromir, in the end, gives his life, and that's what redeems Boromir. Redeems Boromir in the story, redeems Boromir in Frodo's memory, redeems Boromir in the grand narrative, redeems Boromir spiritually for himself. There's a beautiful ending where, you know, his city receives the body of Boromir back, and it's sort of recognized he actually did fulfill his duty, just in a way that ended up having to, like, relinquish power and defend true righteous power, right? And so in the same way, this is why we need story, because story is about change. It's about, or at least the possibility of change, of transformation, of redemption. And Pence is an example of that. Not the only one. I have the same sort of arc I have with William Barr, another character who I was deeply troubled by, who was a devout Catholic. And again, I think was operating with that kind of Boromir logic of power. But ultimately, in the end, was part of what the narrative called Team Normal, like rallying the team within the Trump administration to say, this is insane what you are trying to do, President Trump, in seizing power.
You know, there's an interesting conundrum that was presented throughout the Trump presidency. And I would submit that anyone who says that I know the exact right answer to this question is fooling themselves. And it's this, and this is something my Advisory Opinions flagship podcast of the Whole Dispatch Network co-host, Sarah Isgur, has written about. Sarah worked in the administration, was DOJ spokesperson under Attorney General Sessions. And there was this dilemma. Once Trump became president of the United States, do you join the administration and try to move it as much as you can towards virtue and restrain vice as much as you possibly can? Or do you say, I don't want to be a part of this, I'm not going to be a part of this at all, and sort of then leave the administration with all of its immense power and all of its ability to start wars, for example, to its own, id? Do you leave it to that? And there's a strong argument that says, no, you engage and you try to bend it towards the good and try to mitigate the evil, and you do your best. Now, that also dovetails, the seduction of that is that it dovetails with your personal ambition. Yeah. It's sort of like, oh, I can do so much good while I'm elevated to this national position. And that has a, that has a ring of power element to it, right? It is, but in this case, I say ring of power element to it, but I have told, and I did tell people, and I stand by this advice, that people came to me in 2016 after he won, and they said, I'm being offered in a position. And I said, we need good people in government, but you cannot make your position an idol. That That's your right. position should not, and the preservation and your maintenance of your power cannot be your priority. Because what ends up happening is, if a small thing comes up and you skip past it saying, I need to keep my power, and then something of medium magnitude comes up and you get past it because you need to keep your power, ultimately what ends up happening is you get in the habit of making the decision to keep your power. But I got to say, aren't we grateful that Bill Barr was Attorney General and not, say, Pam Bondi, right?
Yeah. Or Jeffrey Clark, right?
Or Jeffrey Clark. And so we did need people there. We had to have them. If we didn't have them, I shudder to think what would have occurred. And there's another thing. I just want to put a pause on that and get your thoughts on that, Curtis. Like this balance of, yes, we need there is a need for virtue in high places. We absolutely have to have that. We need virtue in high places. With the tension with, how much can you trust yourself?
That's right.
To exercise that virtue if you're offered the high place.
And this is why I think it's actually really helpful and potentially formational and self-changing for Christians to pay attention to the January 6th hearings, because some of the same dynamics and temptations that you're describing are in play with any administration official in the Trump administration, is in play with any Christian in any institution, because all institutions, I believe, are human. They're spiritual beings, and so they're all going to be fallen also. They reflect God, but they also reflect sin. And so any institution that any of our listeners are joining or part of, frankly, Christian or secular, are going to have versions of institutional problems, of institutional vice, of institutional corruption even. It may be not so profound as to be defining the institution, but there's some forms of it. That's just the nature of the doctrine of human sin, of that all are fallen, and that all encompasses not just all individuals, but all institutions as well. And so if you're part of a company, if you're part of a school, you work for a school, you work for a nonprofit, you work for a local government agency, you have your own version of these same dynamics that are going to be in play, where something is happening in that organization that you're going to have to decide, do I go along with? Do I just not say anything? Because that could jeopardize my own position and my own power or my own standing. Or do I step up and say something? And by the way, the answer isn't always on every case.
Right.
You double down and you say something. There's a discernment and a wisdom involved. But if you can look back on your last, couple years in your institution, and you have never put your status or your standing in that institution on the line for the sake of virtue, for the sake of right, for the sake of being a agent of redemption, then that's a warning sign. Yeah. That's a red flag.
If you find that you're just a great fit, especially as thoroughly countercultural, honestly, as Christianity is to our present moment, and basically in different ways to every moment, to every moment. If you find yourself like just always fitting so well, that's a warning flag. I also want to raise this tension between humility and judgment. Okay. So let me pull back from January 6th. I wrote a couple of weeks ago a pretty strong piece on a Sunday about the Uvalde shooting and the response of the police to the Uvalde shooting, and how there were dozens of officers who were either immediately outside the classroom or outside the school while people were bleeding and dying and pleading for help in those 2 classrooms. And by people, I mean young children bleeding and dying and pleading for help in these classrooms. And they stood outside for minute after minute after minute until it was over an hour. And there's sort of 2 things that can happen at once. One is, I feel like you have to call that out and say that's completely unacceptable. That is not what our society needs from police officers. If you saw it in a soldier, we would know immediately and instantaneously that that person, that presents to all the world as you were prioritizing your own life over the lives of those people under threat. At the same time, you can say that was objectively unacceptable. At the same time, unless you've been in that situation, you need to make that judgment with the humility of knowing that could be you.
Yeah.
Now, a lot of people would say, no, never, not me, absolutely not me. But, I served in Iraq, and I know that there was often a gap between bravado and bravery. There was, and so I think there's this combination of necessary judgment with profound humility. And it's a difficult thing to sort of declare. It's a difficult thing to sort of live publicly. You got to judge, but you also have to judge the objectively wrong thing, but you have to approach it with profound humility at the same time. And those are difficult things to hold in tension.
Well, that's right. And that is the Christian narrative, is that in the cross, we see a, absolute declaration that sin is real and has consequences. And at the same time, an extension of grace and mercy. And to hold both of those were held in this beautiful tension in the cross, right? Mm-hmm. And that sin needs to be named, moral failure needs to be judged. There are consequences to it, and at the same time, there's a grace and mercy extended to all. And I agree. It is incredibly difficult to hold that, to name it for what it is. At the same time, do so with a grace that is the cousin of humility, I think. It's funny when you were talking about the Uvalde sort of tragedy and moral failing, the failure
mm-hmm.
of courage at the point of testing there. I was like trying to think, how would I mean, you've at least had combat experience, so you sort of know firsthand what it's, how much courage it takes to actually would have taken to enter the building. And I know this is going to sound trivial, but the closest I can come to was going back to, again, our fantasy baseball drafts that we get back together every year. We do some sort of manly test of courage or manly experience, right? Our guys, as guys do. And one year, do you remember the year we were in Boston and we did the paintball
I
thing?
do.
So that was the closest I've ever come to urban combat, David. And I remember that feeling. I'm wearing the helmet. I've got the paintball gun, and it's indoors in this sort of warehouse-like environment. And I have to go decide, am I going to peek around the corner into a hallway with the possibility I may get pelted by very painful, these are like very painful paintball pellets.
It's like a bee sting. Yeah.
It's more than a bee sting.
Hornet. Hornet.
So I remember my heart pounding and just like freezing at the corner, like, maybe I'll just stay behind the corner here. And just because I didn't want to get hurt. That experience is actually helpful for me to like, that's what was going on for the police officers. Now, it doesn't excuse the fact that they failed at the test of courage, but it gives us some ability to say that was a human failing. That was not just, you can't paint them as monsters or as sort of this sort of inhuman sort of caricature of, sort of moral sort of,
right.
failure. It was real. It's a real human experience that they were going through there.
Well, and one of the things that anyone who knows anything about training people to confront that ultimate moment, which is, literally, you just can't even describe, unless you've been in the situation, what it feels like to say, much less like if things are actually, that things are, actually where there's an actual firefight, which to be clear, I was never in an actual firefight in Iraq. So that is a test I didn't have to face. But the act of getting in a vehicle, say, for example, and you know that you're going to be driving in the next 2 hours of your life, you're going to be driving across roads where we know that Al-Qaeda has been seeking to implant IEDs there. It's what we would call an uncleared road. In other words, there's been no ability to sort of minesweep the road. You walk into that and you say, I could just right now be beginning the last few minutes of my life. It's an indescribable feeling. It's just an indescribable feeling. And one of the things that makes you get in, walk in there, and this is one of the lower bars in Iraq, right? That's one of the lower bars, much less, that situation of having to look around a wall when high velocity rounds are incoming or potentially incoming or whatever. One of the things, there's a couple of things that keep you going forward. One is love and the other one is shame. You have regard. You love the people around you and you cannot let them down. You have that love that you have for the people that you're serving with is too powerful for you to for you to expose them to danger because of your actions. And then there's also right beside that the shame of knowing that if I don't even have this level of courage, come on, what on earth? So it's these two things at the same time that operate that I think push you past your inherent human nature, which is absolutely towards self-preservation.
Yeah, and I think this actually gets to this important interplay between institutions and individuals, institutional virtue and individual virtue. Because actually institutions are meant ultimately, like I said, to reflect virtue. And actually not just reflect virtue, but sustain virtue. Mm-hmm. Because what institutions do is they both bring people together around a common shared set of virtues, right? So in your case, your troop is the U.S. Army is this institution, bring you and your troopmates together under a set of definitions of what virtue, what courage, and love and loyalty to one another means. It means getting into the armored personnel vehicle together, right? And pursuing that mission together. And that's what institutions at their best do, is they embody and sustain virtue so that it is easier for individuals to actually live out their true best selves. And institutions at their worst, right, is the actual corruption of that. They actually make it easier for individuals to act in their worst impulses. They actually lead them to their vices and so forth. And so this interplay of institutions and individuals is how we are formed, right? And what I think is so interesting, to take it back to January 6th, is that you saw how important institutional norms were to empowering people to act their best, right? So, for instance, when Trump wants to order the military, or is considering ordering the military to seize the voting booths, right? The military en masse can say, no, we're not doing that. That is a contravention of our deepest military ethic, of that we are not we are not about being tools of power for civilian authorities for their ends, right? And so there's a deep institutional ethic and values that empowers that individual general, and I can't remember who it was, whether it was Mark Miley or whoever, to actually to act at his true best and to resist the appeals of power. And so that's at its best. We also see, of course, the opposite of that, where the temptation of institutions is that when they go bad, they can corrupt people and entice people to act their worst. And we saw that in January 6th. And actually, I'd be, where did you see that? Or where did you see both institutional virtue and vice in play, David, in January 6th?
Oh,
and how it impacted individual actions.
Yeah. So the institutional virtue, I think you located some of it correctly in the military. There's a tidal institutional force in the military against involvement in political affairs, towards the orderly transition of power, towards upholding the Constitution, so that while there's a lot of people who have a lot of problems in the military, one of the things, especially in the post-Vietnam era, as the military didn't just revamp itself and reform itself tactically, strategically, in its equipment and capabilities, it reformed itself ethically as well. And so there's a very tidal force ethically towards upholding American constitutional norms in the military, so that going against that tidal force is profoundly difficult. It's profoundly difficult. In the other areas where you saw that was actually in the bipartisan leadership from McConnell to Pelosi. And we are going to finish certifying this election. We are not going to be the first Congress to fail to uphold its duty here in this circumstance. And so there was a tidal force against that. Now, what were some institutional forces against that tidal force towards virtues? There's a counter institution that's driven, a countercultural institutional structure, for example, that's been created in right-wing media that has its own tidal forces that become difficult for people to resist. So it's a grim reality that a majority of Republicans voted not to certify the election. Now, there's no credible good faith reason to do that. Let's just lay that out there. Don't come at me with an idea that there was a credible argument to not certify the election. If you're going to put that in the comments, I'm not going to respond. Just please go read more of the Dispatch. If you want to talk about some of those thoroughly debunked legal and political theory, legal theories and factual conspiracies, just read more of our stuff. But anyway, there wasn't a good faith reason to do that, but there were incredibly powerful cultural and institutional reasons to do that, created by this sort of alternative right-wing universe that is not, sadly, in many ways oriented towards virtue.
Well, and we see how much the institution of journalism has fallen, in particular at Fox News, even in the hearings, where you have this transcript of Sean Hannity on the election taking his message points straight from Mark Meadows, the chief of staff, even at one point saying, "Yes, sir." Here's the fourth estate, the journalist that's actually saying, yes, actually confirming, what am I supposed to hit? What message points am I supposed to hit? And then saying, "Yes, sir," as his sort of institutional relationship to government, which is just the opposite of the very institutional ethos of independent journalism, right?
Yeah.
And so this is why, again, I think why my soapbox is always to call Christians to take institutions seriously, because institutions, they are human sustainers and reflectors of virtue, or they can be corruptors of vice. And so the health of our institutions really matters for us as Christians, for those of us who, as all Christians should be, believe we are meant to reflect God's virtue in the world. We can't do that really apart and outside of institutions. And I don't just mean the national institutions, because not all of us, most of us are not going to have a place in those national institutions other than, as voters and as observers. But again, to repeat, we are all part of our own local institutions, and the same dynamics of whether or not we are going to be individuals that, both are shaped by the best of our institutions and also in return shape our institutions toward their best selves, because institutions are fragile beings. As human beings, human institutions are also participate in human fragility. And one person, one individual, like Donald Trump, can do an enormous amount of damage to the institutional virtues that are meant to be there for us as individuals to sustain our individual virtue.
Right, right. And, when institutions become very weak, in much the way the party institutions have become weak,
Yeah.
so they can not only be sort of strong but wrong,
Yeah.
it's also weak and ineffectual.
No, that's
even
right.
if sort of in theory they have some ability to check. That's also a profound problem. And I think that's exactly right. What are the tidal forces that your institution is creating? What is it pushing you towards virtue, or is it pushing you towards vice, where virtue has to resist it?
Yeah.
And the Trump administration became an institution unto itself.
Yeah.
And its tidal force was absolutely pushing towards vice. Absolutely. And so that's what to circle back around. Let's we've got a few more minutes. I want to go back to where we started, Curtis. And where we started.
Back to the Warriors, you mean?
No.
Oh.
Back to the January 6th where we started.
Oh, right. That other topic. Okay.
Yeah, the other topic. These two competing visions of Christian activism in public life, and or how you put your Christian faith into practice. And here's what was so striking to me about those two competing visions on January 6th. Again, I'm going to say I disagreed with Mike Pence a ton before those fateful days. So just there, everything I say doesn't mean I agreed with him before. But this is so important. This is so important, this contrast. On January 6th, the mob outside was using their Christian faith to justify the grasp of power.
Yeah.
Inside the building, Mike Pence was appealing to his Christian faith and the courage of his convictions derived from his Christian faith to give him the courage to relinquish power.
Yeah.
And I think that is such a dramatic. Rarely do you get a kind of black and white moment that's so profound, and it's so countercultural to sort of this new right, which places sort of the strength of your Christianity is in its ability to seize and hold power for virtuous ends. And that's what those folks outside would believe with all their heart they were doing. They were using their strength and their power to seize and hold power for virtuous ends. Whereas Pence had enough faith, and he had enough faith that he didn't, obviously he believed that the Trump administration should win. He campaigned hard. Hard.
Should in a kind of like a moral, like desire that they win the election. But yeah.
He believed with all his heart it was better for America.
That's right.
If the Trump campaign was successful. And yet he had sort of the bedrock faith to say, my role right now as a believer in Jesus Christ is to lose.
Yeah.
And is to shepherd this country through my loss.
Yeah.
And that is I think it's so important to put that out there as, now that's not to say that your goal as a Christian is to always lose, right?
Right.
We've been involved in religious liberty battles where we fervently hoped and prayed we win, but at that moment, what a contrast, I think, between those two competing strands of what it meant to be a Christian in public life.
I think that's right. And that is a contrast that's a narrative contrast that we should hold into our minds as we think about how Christians ought to engage in power, because there are less sort of obvious or less dangerous versions of the sort of Christian nationalism that you saw out there. Because people will be like, well, I'm not going to be part of a mob that tries to take over the Capitol.
Yeah,
true.
Right,
that's true for most people. But it is still tempting to think, oh, the answer is that I seize power and we do whatever it takes to seize power, even if it runs over important norms and other values, because I know I'm right. I know my side is right. And and that's certainly, you're absolutely right. That is sort of the ethos of Christian nationalism on the right. But I actually think we need to call out that there is a less obvious and maybe less dangerous, but still important to name version of that on the left as well, right?
Yeah.
That the idea is we just need to win. and we'll do whatever it takes to win because our side is right, or at least our side is better, and we'll run over whatever we needed to do in order to do that. And it may not be storming the Capitol, but it could mean canceling somebody. It could mean getting somebody, completely, made anathema in the public realm, and hounding them out of any sense of ability to participate in the public realm because they're on the wrong side of things, right?
Or firebombing or vandalizing a crisis pregnancy center. I mean, the FBI right now is investigating as domestic terrorism this campaign of violence against crisis pregnancy centers. The other one is hollowing out of left-wing institutions. This will now be the third podcast I've talked about this article, but Ryan Grimm in The Intercept, and I don't know if you saw this, we'll put it in the show notes, but Ryan Grimm in The Intercept talked about, in the he talks about how young activists have come into a host of sort of progressive institutions and sort of hollowed them out. They just crippled them from the inside out with internecine. Is that how you say it? Internecine?
Intercina? I don't know.
Internecine.
We need a primer? I think we need a primer on how to pronounce that.
Primer on how to pronounce internecine. But brought them to a standstill through internecine fighting about sometimes arguments and about things that are just remarkably petty. Remarkably petty and ungracious. And so we have focused, because we're in the aftermath of January 6th hearings, on what happened with the Trump administration. But my gosh, I don't look at this political landscape and see healthy movements abounding on the right or the left.
Well, you think about the institution of higher education, where the left dominates culturally there, and how much this ethos of power over any other virtue of like discourse, humility, listening, tolerance, but just sheer power, like our view will prevail in what's happening in classrooms, where basically any dissenting voice to a progressive orthodoxy on a range of issues, on any range of issues, but especially on issues of race and sexuality, is completely squelched out of pure power plays. I mean, it is just pure. It is the intellectual version of storming the Capitol, right? I mean, again, I'm not saying it's the same thing. I'm just saying, I'm making an analogy as saying it's the intellectual version of saying we're just going to win and shut out everybody else, and actually our traditional norms of free inquiry and freedom of speech be damned. Yeah. And, I just finished a piece for The Atlantic for my newsletter about, there's a Washington Post report that over the last 2 academic years, more than 160 teachers, and this is an absolute undercount because this is based on, the Washington Post trying to comb through social media and news reports combing through social media and news reports, but more than 160 teachers in K through 12 have been fired or have resigned under pressure based on political disputes on their point of view, both inside and outside the classroom, that they've expressed, by the way. And what's interesting about their study, again, this is an undercount, but anytime you see people fired for expressing a point of view, that has a radiating, chilling effect. Yeah. So when when they were able to find, this is kind of funny, Curtis, because I'm often accused of both sidesism, because every time I'll say, hey, the right's got a problem, I'll say, wait, the left has a problem, and people go, oh, you're just both sidesing. But listen to this. So in the times when the Post was able to definitively find political firings in the last 2 academic years, firings, not resignations, but actual firings, they found equal numbers were fired for adhering to conservative ideology and for adhering to liberal ideology. Equal numbers. So what you're talking about is sort of a bipartisan, and I'll put this in the show notes as well, a bipartisan commitment to this graceless cancel culture that is teaching our kids to appeal to authority when they feel that, when they feel, and there's a key word there, when they feel hurt by opposing points of view. And I'm sorry, that's just unsustainable. That's just unsustainable if we're hoping to build a pluralistic republic. Yeah, I think we need to talk about the power of story narrative. We need a narrative of like the academic, higher education academic equivalent to a Mike Pence moment, like some administrator who just refuses to go along with the mob movement to cancel, to reject, to censor someone simply because they have an opposing view. Our culture needs those stories as well, because they, like you said, the stories of vice, of cowardice, of giving into the mob, say whether it's on Capitol Hill or in the halls of academia, that does have a chilling effect. It sends out a warning to everybody else to keep your head low and just go, not act courageously. Conversely, a story like a Pence moment, or the story that we need, the equivalent of that story we need in higher ed, it has a chance to be emboldening, right? To actually fortify people's courage, to be a role model for a different way of being. And we need those stories, David. We need to hear them. We need to live them. We need to tell them.
And my view is, when we hear those stories, we need to applaud the people who were central to them, even if there is a history of, even if there is a history of problems. We need to applaud that, because we cannot take courage for granted, even if courage is expected in the moment. Yeah, I think the most infuriating thing I read is, "Oh, yay, you're applauding Mike Pence for doing his duty." Well, isn't that what we honor soldiers for? Doing their job? Isn't that the reason why we say to soldiers, for example, "Thank you for your service"? Now, there are some who go way above and beyond the call of duty, but we don't reserve our appreciation for the people who have silver stars, right, or above. We don't reserve our appreciation for the people who have any form of decoration. We have to reserve our appreciation for everyone who serves honorably, because we know that part of this system of building systems, powerful systems of virtue, is to appreciate when someone does their duty, especially when doing their duty is hard. And I'm sorry, if doing your duty means that somebody might hang you, if doing your duty means that the Proud Boys, who are 40 feet away from you, might kill you in front of your family, like, I'm going to applaud that. I'm sorry. And I'm not going to like it when somebody goes, "Oh, well, he was just doing what he had to do." Okay, yeah, you be in that situation. Right. I will grant you, I will appreciate that statement of, "Oh, he's just doing the minimum," if you can point to me where your life was in danger and you did the right thing. Okay, granted, you have standing. If you haven't been in that situation, can we just say thank you? Yeah. Can we just say thank you?
And David, in that situation, does the story of valor on the paintball fields qualify?
I'm sorry, Curtis. I'm sorry to tell you. I am sorry to say.
Well, I think this has been such a really helpful conversation, I think, David, in terms of making a case for why we ought to be paying attention to the January 6th hearings, that what we have before us is a public storytelling going on. It's a morality tale playing before our eyes, and as all morality tales, it's complex. Really good morality tales. It's complex. We're not saying people are just uniformly good or bad, heroic or cowards. It's a real mix, and we see ourselves reflected in some way in the stories that are being played out on that stage. So let's pay attention and let's reflect on those. Both for what it says about our country, but especially what it says about for us and our own individual calling in our own respective institutions.
Absolutely. Well, Curtis, let me end where I began. Congratulations to your Warriors.
Thank you.
Congratulations to my Grizzlies for being established as the second best team in the NBA.
That's right.
The team that gave the champs their hardest test.
And we're going to go at it again next season. I can tell we're going to be locked in for this battle for a while. You're the up and coming challengers. We're the old guard that we're going to defend this hill until somebody pries it out of our dead grasping fingers.
Yeah, when you come at the king, you best not miss.
You best not miss.
All right. Well, thank you all for listening. As always, please go rate us where you get your podcast. Please subscribe. Check out Curtis's work at redeemingbabel.org and check out my work at thedispatch.com, and we will be back next Saturday.